Oop, thank you. All right. Well, I would like to open this by congratulating you. It's a lovely morning, and you're all here, so that's very cool. We have a lovely space, which is amazing. Well, for people who don't know me, I spent roughly a decade listening, and rewriting, and training people on how to tell stories. Now, the practical output of that is people who would meet investors, VCs, and raise capital. Now, as I started doing it early on, I was a bright-eyed coach who was like, I want to change the world, I want to help people. And some of that is still inside of me. I'm still hopeful in that sense. But what I realized along the way is that human beings don't always do what is correct. Human beings satisfy, as it's known. They do sometimes the bare minimum, sometimes they cheat, sometimes they say things that are not completely true, sometimes they say things that are a little more broad. So I'm going to tell you 2 stories, and then I'm going to show you roughly 8 slides. That's it. And if we have a little time left over, I'm going to take one of you as a volunteer to be a real-life example of how to tell a story that is true. How does that sound, guys? All right. So 2 stories. They're roughly 10 years apart. I'm going to keep them short for the sake of it. I'm not going to tell you exactly who the protagonists are, as in the heroes of the story, but some of you would even guess it. So the first story starts in 2003. So this is quite a few years ago, right? 20 years ago. This is a story about a woman who studied at a prestigious Ivy League university, chemical engineering, and she decided to tackle a problem she personally had both in her family and herself. She wanted to test with a finger prick a simple vial of blood that does not require you to go have multiple sessions, especially for people who have a phobia against it. So she started a company that would do this particular testing with a very little drop of blood. Now I'm going to pause here and just quickly check how many of you have heard this story before. Please raise your hand. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm glad to see a lot of colleagues here, but most of you don't. Now, fast forward several years, she raises massive amounts of capital from some professional investors, but quite a few folks who maybe were more considered tourists in the space, but were very, very wealthy. This woman raised $1.4 billion for her company. I let that sink in for a little bit, a massive amount of money. She got massively covered by the media, including the notorious Forbes, I think 30 under 30. She was able to attract the belief of other people to join her, including very, very smart people who guided the development of her early projects. This woman's name is Elizabeth. Recently, I think like a year ago, if I'm not mistaken, quite recently, she was convicted of multiple counts of fraud. Specifically, the investors that realized that the technology she was pitching, almost what she presented as a life-saving technology, was not working. Yet the story she kept on telling had the same basic premise, a lot of the heroic narratives we read in books, see in movies, right, in theaters like this. She was able to persuade people in her vision. And if you're a founder here, you realize that this is partially part of your job description. You're trying to persuade people to join you on a mission, which is sometimes very risky. Sometimes you position it as it's going to change people's lives. Sometimes that story goes well, and sometimes that story doesn't go so well. 10 years later after that, there was another, this time a man, his name is Adam, decided to build a company in the real estate space. And he, in turn, was able to attract roughly $22 billion, or at least his company did. The names, some of the top-tier investment funds on the planet. So, for example, one of them is Goldman Sachs. I think JP Morgan Chase, if I'm not mistaken. $22 billion. That company went public with some ups and downs in between, and at some point even reached a valuation of $47 billion. These are state-level numbers. It's not just normally a company. Do you know how much that company is worth nowadays? Any guesses? 100 mil? Well, I think it's filed for bankruptcy, if I'm not mistaken. It was worth, until recently, around 100 mil. It was fluctuating due to stock market prices. This company is called WeWork. You might have heard of this company. And the man who started it is Adam Newman. The two stories, what I'm telling you, have one main thing in common. Both of those people were excellent at persuading others in their vision, telling stories specifically for raising money and attracting very smart people to work with them. Now, why am I telling this to you? Many of you are just raising $100,000 max. Some of you are just thinking about starting a company. Some of you are currently working for corporations. Why am I telling you this? Now, think of this as a disclaimer that you have underneath a drug. Now, I spent over a decade teaching people how to tell stories. I realized that this doesn't always work like that. But what I ideally want is when a person comes here on stage, tells me the basics of who they are, what they do, and why they do it, but when they say it, they give their best to tell what they mean. They open up. But a lot of time, incentives comes in. I also realized there's a thing called narcissism. I don't know if you know what that is. People, occasionally, that want to build companies and have the mental fortitude, so to speak, to take the risk necessary, because it's more than 9 out of 10 companies fail, often don't exactly fully deal with that risk. They still feel uncertainty and fear, but it's heavily mitigated. Now, I'm not a clinical psychologist diagnosing those two individuals. There's plenty of research, or at least papers published on the subject of their personalities and so forth. There's some particular visionary leadership. What I can tell you, though, is in those individuals, although get benefits from mitigated stress, they have high conviction in their vision, so they deeply believe in their visions, but they also not always pursue truthful statements. And I'm not saying they're lying all the time, but in the case of Elizabeth, it was proven to be true. They do a thing called BSing. I'm just going to say bullshit. There's a great book by Harry G. Frankfurt from Princeton that published in 2005, who's attempting to define the term bullshit. And the way it's different from lying is when people start giving the impression of something as opposed to explicitly saying facts that are not true. You might state that you believe in community like Adam did. You might even put the word we in the whole company. But when push comes to shove, you're going to cash out, and a lot of your employees, besides maybe the first 150, are not going to make a lot of money. You might believe that, in fact, you're helping people and saving lives, but you might dismiss the research and the science-based suggestions from your whole team when they're telling you, listen, they cannot physically work. So there is a contradiction in place. On one end, you need the confidence to take the abundant risk that comes building a company, but on the other end, you still need to have the intellectual humility to be able to make the right decisions, to make the right judgment calls. And I found that's a very big ask. This is extremely rare. More likely, a person decides that they want to either become successful, let's say glory, fame, they want to make a lot of money, they want to become rich. Maybe they get FOMO when they see one of those TechCrunch articles, right? So-and-so raised this much. They get that general sense that they're missing out, then maybe they will come up with a back-filled rationalization what they're doing in this company. We want to change lives. Now, obviously, human beings are very different. This is not just the domain of startups. This is the domain of corporations, governments, even nonprofits. And this is not just to do with these two individuals. These are just examples. There's many thousands of people that I met that are maybe on the spectrum of that. Many of you don't make fully rational decisions. The classic example I normally give is, why did I buy this watch? I might have bought it because I'm a runner, and I need to track my progress. A perfectly reasonable, rational explanation. I might have bought it because, well, Garmin has been investing in marketing and putting their products in key locations, maybe in a particular airport or shop that I happened to pass by, and then I saw it, and then I post-hoc rationalized why I bought it. I explained it after the fact. What it means for you is that to tell an honest story, well, it's not enough to simply go by feeling only. You've got to actually hold yourself accountable. Like, listen, did I really believe that at the time? And it's not just for startup founders, it's also for venture capitalists. People who are making decisions, massive bets, very often they will not always tell you this. Some of them will honestly tell you. They make decisions with their gut feeling. And maybe after the fact, they will write a memo. They shouldn't, but they do. Or explain a fancy model with numbers to their investors, their LPs, why they made that decision. How many of you already on an intuitive level knew this? Could you please raise your hand? Thank you very much. I am obviously seeing several of you are very experienced, colleagues even, but most of you don't. People don't always make rational decisions. Instead, they respond to incentives. This is a code that I always keep in mind. So I used to work in finance for an investment firm a bit. I built several companies of my own, no massive exits. Predominantly, I'm just a pitch coach. When you say incentives, if you're a salesperson, you're getting paid, let's say, a commission. One of the easiest ways you can increase sales is to lower prices if they allow you to. Yes, you increase sales, but the cost of profitability. So you do one little tweak. Let's say you want to motivate your kid to study mathematics. Let's go back to high school, so to speak. Let's say you start paying them money to do calculus, fractions. Maybe you start bribing them. Now, what happens when you remove that particular incentive, that reward, so to speak? Will that kid still learn math? They might, but not as eagerly. Now, in fact, my dad did exactly this. He paid me for good grades. Luckily for him, I also had intrinsic motivation, and I kept going. But it did demotivate me a little bit. So when you hire people, you might give them a big vision. You might show them that what they're doing has meaning and has impact, and they feel more motivated. I mean, you might also pay them not just a fair wage, but you provide them with stock options and a great deal of money. But ultimately, what I want is not just people who are pursuing greed, basically, fame, ego. I want people who are able to keep that in check. I'm not asking you to be saints or something. I want people to tell a story that they believe, and they make an honest bet, a guess, that what they're doing is intrinsically useful for other people, and they want to invite others on that journey. You feel me, guys? I feel a little like a priest here, but let's give it a shot. But we have a problem, guys. This was true for Elizabeth, and it's true for many of you, unfortunately. And to illustrate this, I would like to offer you a game. Very simple game. It will be hypothetical, no real money at stake, but bear with me, humor me. People who know what this is a 20-sided die, and for many of you, this will mean that I probably play Dungeons & Dragons. I'm quite a bit of a nerd, all right? Nerd alert. This has 20 sides, so unlike the normal 6-sided die, so 1 to 6 dots, this has 1 to 20 numbers. Let's say I offer you a game. If you hit a 20, I will pay you $20,000. But if you hit any other number from 1 to 19, you will pay me $1,000. Question, and you will be voting. It will be interactive. Should you play this game? And ask yourself, would you really? I'm not literally offering you $20,000, just for the record. I'm obliged to say it for legal reasons, I think. Please raise your hand, and I'll repeat the stakes. 20, if you hit 20 on this 20-sided die, you get $20,000. If you hit any other number, you pay me $1,000. How many of you would like to play this game? And be honest. Please raise your hand. I see a little on the top, okay. Most of you would not play this game. And some of you said yes. The trick here is why? How did you make that decision? Well, there's a very basic calculation if you want to be perfectly rational about this. Probability of loss, probability of gain, amount lost, amount gained. So what's the probability of losing $1,000? 95%. What's the probability of winning 20,000? 5%. You multiply 5% by 20,000? Come on. People with calculus? 1,000. You multiply 95% by 1,000? Listen, guys. 950, 1,000, 1,000 minus 950. The expected value is positive. Technically, you should play this game. Overall, you're going to win. This is not dissimilar from the game you would be playing when you start a startup. Probability of winning anything is extremely low. I mean it. I've burned out twice. Probability of unicorn, depending on the data set you look at, and I have collected a data set on this, sometimes less than 1%. The whole game is built according to a power law distribution. If you don't know what a power law distribution is, I'm going to start with a very basic one. So how tall you are follows a normal distribution, a bell curve, right? So I'm roughly 6'2", or in European terms, 189 centimeters. That puts me roughly 94th, 95th percentile among US males. Now I'm from Estonia. If I would be somewhere in the Netherlands, Holland, I would be probably average, because Dutch people are pretty tall apparently. Venture capital doesn't follow this distribution exactly. Although the VCs will still be of certain height and so forth, their portfolio, the collection of companies, follows a chart that looks like this once again. Very few winners and a long graveyard of losers and some few companies that are in between. But to summarize the findings of the American Automobile Association, I think 73, 74% of drivers believe they're above average drivers. Everybody thinks they're special and they're going to win. We think in terms of narratives. We think about how people perceive us. To be able to detach on that level, not just get clung, basically stick on a TechCrunch article, so-and-so is this much, not just to pay attention to the success stories, because you will have a long graveyard too, not just survivorship bias. You need to be able to not optimize purely for what people think of you. And for most people, that's extremely difficult, because we're social animals. We want to please others, we want to be looked, we want to see ourselves as good people. Listen, guys, when you write your pitch and you want to include a story, yes, you're sometimes competing. You want to win $1 million. Sometimes you want to raise that capital and you have meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting and you're sick and tired of your own voice. And you're not sleeping very well. And so you, of course, start tweaking your deck. You start tweaking your narrative. You start tweaking how you say things just to get what you want. I have something else in mind. My core belief is that when you pitch or persuade, your responsibility is to help another person make a better decision. Now, I'm not ignorant of the fact that the way people make decisions is not always rational, like we just demonstrated with this little game, with the 20-sided die. It starts with you basically at least being honest with yourself why you're doing what you're doing, and then making an educated, detached bet about the company. Now, I'm not dismissing passion. I'm not dismissing conviction in the mission or vision that you're doing. But did you actually validate? Did you actually talk to customers before you built it? Did you actually go for the steps of identifying on a global level what are the companies that have attempted to solve exactly the problem you're attempting to solve? Have you looked at your competitors in a way that doesn't just dismiss them? Oh yeah, Microsoft tried it, but they don't know how to do it. And then I hear statements like that. I simply don't believe it. Now, the root cause of a lot of this is a need for both safety, certainty. You tell that story to yourself and others to feel in control, because fundamentally you're a social animal that is afraid. You want to feel safe around you. You start telling these narratives, be that I'm doing this because, so people would either accept you, that they would not fire you from your job, that would give you capital. Very often you tell that to be consistent, congruent to your own view of yourself. But safety is at the core of it. A lot of us are afraid. We have a craving for certainty. Probabilities, hard. Uncertainty, what something might or might not happen, terrifying for most. Do you guys get me here? Don't put the Band-Aid just to make yourself feel better. Think of what you can actually help people with and build a company around that. Start with who, what, and why. Your both skill set, what you've actually done in your life that will lead you to what you're doing, the risks you've taken. Have you conceptualized clearly what exactly are you doing in specific terms as opposed to buzzwords? And why? This is the causal question, that thing that we use to rationalize. Did you actually write things down, your decisions? Did you think through what you want to do in a purposeful way? Otherwise, you're like a stick in a river, just going with the flow. My final message to you guys. I wanted to take a volunteer, but we had quite a few yesterday. When you tell people what you want to do, level with them. Say, I'm afraid of this, I'm excited about this. I'm seeing an opportunity here, I've done this much research. But ultimately, if we get this right, and I believe we have a good bet to do so, we can change the lives of this many people. And the reason I believe this is because I have spoken to those people, I've seen what their pain is, and I care. This will be just a very basic conversation you can have with a co-founder at a coffee shop or after a party. My name is Gleb. I spent too long helping people tell stories, 12 years now. I ask you to connect with me on any social media platform. Many of you I worked with already. Please, next time you tell a story, persuade responsibly. Thank you very much. Madloba.